Now, after months of warnings from the United States and denials from Russia over its plans to invade Ukraine, the die has been cast. Russia announced that it is recognizing two breakaway regions of Ukraine. In response, President Biden has announced the first round of sanctions against Russian banks and individuals in a bid to deter what it fears is the beginning of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Here's a report.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Calling out what he said were illegal acts, U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday announced the first round of new sanctions against Moscow, adding to Western efforts to stop what some fear is the beginning of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
To put it simply, Russia just announced that it is carving out a big chunk of Ukraine. This is a flagrant violation of international law, and it demands a firm response from the international community.
One of the worst security crises in Europe in decades is unfolding as Russian President Vladimir Putin sends what he calls peacekeeping troops to the separatist areas of Donetsk and Luhansk after recognizing them as independent.
I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014.
Biden said sanctions are being applied to VEB Bank and Russia's military bank. Starting on Wednesday, U.S. sanctions will begin against Russian elites and their families.
They share in the corrupt gains of the Kremlin policies and should share in the pain as well.
Earlier on Tuesday, Germany put the brakes on a new gas pipeline from Russia, and Britain also hit Russian banks with sanctions. The Russian Foreign Ministry criticized the new measures as illegitimate. The European Union agreed to new sanctions aimed at politicians, lawmakers, and officials, banning EU investors from trading in Russian state bonds and targeting imports and exports with separatist entities. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov earlier brushed off the threat of sanctions, but Biden warned worse was to come if Russian aggression continues.
And for more on this, we're being joined by James D.J. Brown, an Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University. Thank you so much for joining us. Japan, along with the United States and other countries, have imposed sanctions on Russia. Do you see these sanctions having an impact on Moscow, especially on deterring Russia from further inflaming tensions?
Yeah, it's still really quite early days in terms of the exact details of some of the sanctions. For example, in the case of Japan, we've only got the initial announcement to do with what's going to be introduced. In terms of its effect on the Russian side, well, regrettably, it seems like sanctions are not having a major effect. Sanctions have been imposed on Russia to a large extent already after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It was widely communicated to Russia that massive sanctions would be introduced if they were to invade Ukraine, and yet they've gone ahead nonetheless. And so I think that regrettably, despite the introduction of these sanctions, we're not likely to see a big change in Russia's behavior.
Right. Now, Russia is authorizing use of forces abroad. What does this mean for Ukraine? Now, we know as per Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine does have the right to protect its individual and collective security. What does this mean? What options does it have now?
Well, what this means for Ukraine is that this is very clearly a violation of its sovereignty, a violation of its territorial integrity. These are parts of Ukraine's sovereign territory, and clearly they have been carved off by Russia. In terms of Ukraine's response, they've made it very clear that they are not going to be provoked by the Russian side into military action. They recognize that that can actually serve Russia's interests, because if Ukraine uses military force, then it will be an excuse for Russia potentially to expand its incursions into Ukrainian territory. So instead, Ukraine is trying to remain as calm as possible and instead respond by getting diplomatic support from the international community and also potentially by severing diplomatic ties with Russia.
Right. Also, President Biden says that this is the beginning of an invasion. Can you tell us exactly at what point can this be called a full-scale invasion, and if a diplomatic solution is still possible?
Well, on the second part of that question, it's an unfortunate no. I don't think a diplomatic solution is possible now. And Russia has made that very clear by recognizing these breakaway regions, which is a clear break from the Minsk protocols, which were the basis for diplomatic discussions on this. As to what happens next, I think there are two possible scenarios. There's an optimistic one, which is this is the full extent of Russia's current ambitions, and it will stop with these 2 pieces of territory that they've seized. The pessimistic scenario is that this is just the beginning, and it will expand, first of all, to the other parts of eastern Ukraine that are part of the so-called Donbass region. If that occurs, then in that case, Ukraine will have no option but to begin firing back, and that then could lead to a much wider extent of conflict. So I'm hopeful at the moment that that more optimistic scenario, albeit still terrible for Ukraine, is actually the one that will play out.
All right, Professor Brown, thank you so much for joining us with all your insights on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.